Kathy, can you please introduce yourself? I think Kathy is running a bit behind schedule, so we'll ask Luanda to take it from here, please.
Thank you very much, Sarasa. As our guests and participants start trickling in, I'd like to greet everybody and ask that we wait for a couple of minutes as people enter the virtual room.
I would just like to remind all our attendees that have been admitted to please keep your mics muted while in session until it's your chance to speak. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Sarasa, for the house rules. I'm hoping we could perhaps kick it off and people find us along the way. We have admitted all participants into the virtual room, so everybody is recognizing as a panelist. We'd like to emphasize that if you are not speaking, please keep your mic muted as to not distract the speakers. My name is Luanda Mbongose, and I'm a program officer at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Welcome to the launch of the South Africa Youth Submission. Really fantastic and great work that has been done by youth from South Africa, represented from all provinces of this country. And to start us off, I'd like to welcome Ms. Elizabeth Sideropoulos, my Chief Executive at the South African Institute of International Affairs, to give us her opening remarks. Elizabeth, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Luanda, and thank you in particular for the great work you've been doing with youth in the context of the APRM. I suppose it's good afternoon, at least for people in South Africa and certainly in East Africa. Good afternoon to everybody. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you at the launch of the South African APRM Youth Submission. I think it's an amazing project that we have embarked on at the Institute that takes us to another level of engagement in the APRM process, which has been something that the Institute has been involved in now since pretty much the beginning of the APRM process, APRM as an initiative in 2002. Before I unpack that a little bit, I would like to acknowledge and welcome and thank for their constant and ongoing support the Chief Executive of the APRM Secretariat, Professor Eddie Maloka, and his team. It's always great to have you on in our events and on our panels, but also to work with you in these processes, which are so important. It's also really a great pleasure to have with us and to welcome the South African, the chair of the South African National Governing Council of the APRM process, Mr. Tulani Tafuta, who's joining us from the Eastern Cape this afternoon. It's also great to have with us, joining us from Addis Ababa, Helena Badegard, who you will hear from just after my remarks, representing the Swedish government and CEDA in particular, a long-standing partner of the Institute, and whose support has made this particular initiative possible. And of course, all the youth colleagues and participants who have really shown how important and why it is important to include meaningful participation from the youth in many of these key governance, economic, socioeconomic processes in our country and beyond. As I mentioned earlier, SAI has been involved with the APRM Our process since its inception in 2002. For us, the APRM is important because it is not only because governance is important for the continent in terms of achieving Agenda 2063 and the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's also important because it's a homegrown initiative. It's a process that was developed and rolled out and has picked up steam over the last years as an African initiative, and that is critical. What the APRM process has done, and which is why we also believe it is so important, it has created a tool that really allows us, all societies across the continent, to critically assess and examine our governance record. It's really to look at what the failings are and how to address those failings. If we look at the various reports that have come out over the years, I think they are an amazing record of both the governance framework and the governance universe in individual countries, some of the challenges that countries face, but as well some of the important recommendations that countries should take forward in order to address these gaps. We can argue about how effective that last part of the process has been, and there are obviously a number of variables that one has to take into consideration. But I think the APRM really provides and produces really solid diagnosis in that regard. SAI has worked in a number of initial signatory countries right from the start. We were in Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, Mauritius, about working together. It was about really working together to create civil society awareness of the APRM, the ability and the opportunity created for civil society, broadly defined, to be involved in the process. And that's another area that makes the APRM so important, because it helps to facilitate, it enables, provided countries take it up and use it effectively and sincerely, it provides the opportunity for a social dialogue to emerge, and God knows, we know how important that is in the time that we're living in. You know, the importance of ensuring that social compact is retained and is not lost. I mean, we have reflected on how we have done things over the last 15 or 18 years, and I think the initiative now that we're launching, I think, is reflective of that. It's an initiative that is not about parachuting in and out in a particular country, which we've done before, always working with civil society organizations. It's also not about sort of doing it by simply working together on a written submission. This process that really was piloted for the first time in 2018 in Namibia is really about a much longer sustainable engagement with civil society organizations in country to produce something that is both high quality in terms of the product, but the process of getting to that is what is so important. Because that engagement, both among civil society, but also with government actors and so on, is what is about creating a social trust and working towards building up a social compact. So the Namibia APRM sensitization project, as we called it in 2018, was a year-long project where we worked with CSOs to co-create a submission based on the governance priorities. There, one of the important issues that they identified was that of youth unemployment, and this was actually the theme of Namibia's targeted review in 2019-2020. In the last 2 years, we have now taken that approach to 3 other countries: Botswana, which the report of which was launched recently; South Africa, which we're launching today; and Zimbabwe. And this is again, as I mentioned right at the beginning, a partnership and made possible with the support of the Swedish government in that regard. I also would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge and recognize the partnership in terms of getting this product out and the process around it, which is the partnership with Jasora Consulting. We'll hear from them a little later. We focused here on bringing youth together to compile a submission on areas that they had identified as important. And there were 9 issues. We'll hear more about them in the course of this morning, this afternoon. Youth political participation. It's, we have been saying for a long time that youth participation is more than just a tick box exercise. It's social cohesion and inclusion, peace and security, looking at crime, at gender-based violence, at those kinds of domestic issues. Critically, health and social services. The pandemic has highlighted how important it is to have both health and social safety nets in times of crises. The economic empowerment dimension, which is so critical for youth, where such a large proportion of our youth in South Africa remain unemployed. It's also about the ability of government to take plans that are really well developed and actually roll them out. So the point of institutional planning, the heading in the report, the subheading in the report. It's the issue of land and housing, and we know the history of apartheid and the legacy that has left in that domain. And fundamentally, the issue of education, both basic and higher. If we're going to meet our sustainable development goals, if we're going to reach our developmental objectives, we cannot do that without having an education system that produces both people and skills that the economy and society, I would argue, requires. And then last but not least, of course, climate change. We call it climate change, but we know it's actually a climate crisis. And it is the youth of today that will have to deal with the consequences of that in the future. I think it's a great report. I've had occasion to sort of flip through it. I haven't read it in great detail. I look forward to doing that. A really big thank you to the entire group of young activists, young participants who have made this really a great product and have made also some very useful and important recommendations. And it's amazing that this all happened across 9 provinces and all virtually. Absolutely, we recognize the importance of face-to-face, but we can also do these things virtually, and I think the product and the process has not suffered as a result. I hope that this kind of initiative, this kind of exercise is really something that we can take forward, that this is not just a once-off. I think it's important also in the context of what the APRM Secretariat is doing across a number of countries. It creates an opportunity to hear the voice of the youth really in a substantive way, which is, and this is the spirit, I think, of the APRM. It's about broadening the civic space for debate and dialogue. It's creating the avenues for greater accountability and better governance and better development outcomes. And last and not least, it's critical for building up social trust, an issue that we know is so important when you have pandemics like the one that we're currently in the midst of, how social trust in societies can make all the difference in terms of dealing effectively with pandemics or with other sorts of crises. Let me leave it there. I've probably gone a little over my time, but yes, it's great to have you all here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That's Elizabeth Siropoulos, Chief Executive at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Elizabeth provides a broad overview of SAI's engagement in the APRM. She also gives the importance of the APRM as a mechanism, and also really encourages why it's important for you to have a voice in this regard. And without wasting further time, I'd like to then hand over to Helena Bodegard from CEDA. Thank you.
Thank you, Luanda, and thank you, Elizabeth. Colleagues and friends, it's a pleasure and privilege to address you today from the Swedish Embassy in Addis Ababa, from which Sweden's development cooperation with Africa is managed, including with the APRM and SAIA as key partners. We are all of us involved in long-term work for democracy. This is something that requires patience and commitment, and seldom are there sudden or instant victories. Most often, the work to build and protect democracy and rule of law is long-term and cumbersome. So it's a great pleasure that we can come together today, many of us who play different roles in this work, and to celebrate this achievement. Work for democracy is about institutions, it's about trust in institutions, it's about space to organize, freedom to express and put forward ideas. It's about holding power holders accountable. It's about having an environment where opposing views can be put forward without fear of repercussions or violence. And how a country is governed is the business of every man, woman, boy, and girl who lives in the country as citizens or as migrants or refugees. And in Africa in particular, it's an issue for young people. Aspects of democracy and good governance are measured and followed up by researchers over the world, and people's perceptions are subject to surveys such as APRM in Africa and similar institutions elsewhere. And there is a worldwide decline of the quality of democracy and support for democracy. Popular demand is still strong in Africa, fortunately, whereas the supply is not up to these expectations. Swedish development cooperation does focus strongly on democracy and human rights. It amounts to about a third of the total support. And convinced that different actors need to be involved, support to cooperation is directed to civil society to a large extent, and to processes where civil society and governmental bodies, be it on national or regional level, interact. We believe that a wide range of voices need to be heard, different topics reviewed and analyzed, push for change and justice and equality need to be expressed in many different ways and through different channels. By educating girls and boys, by having independent media, by claiming rights, by negotiating, by compromising, by always having in mind that everybody does not have the same preconditions and voice. The report that we gather around today is an amazing product, as Elizabeth has been pointing out. It reflects that young people's perspective is crucial and needs to be at the basis of decision-making, allocation of resources, policy agendas in South Africa, as well as in my country and elsewhere. I'm impressed by the broad scope, looking at so many different aspects of life and encompassing perspectives for so many different categories of young people. Youth is not a homogeneous category. And for us who work on regional level, it's fantastic to see how the policy level work, the African Youth Charter, for instance, can be concretized, and that the Africa peer review mechanisms can be given flesh and blood in your specific context. You have peers, as have been mentioned, in Namibia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe, who've been through similar processes. You're part of a larger process in Africa and over the world in opposing autocratization and building with patience, passion, and hard work your democracies. So a big thank you for great work. We hope that what you have produced will be taken seriously by the South African government and the APRM bodies. We do remain committed to support democracy and especially young women's and men's contributions to improving governance in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Helena. Our program director for this event has now joined us. It has been an honor to fill in for Kathy. And Kathy, I'm now handing over to you officially. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Luyanda, and to all of the panelists that are part of this afternoon's conversation. Firstly, apologies for coming late onto the agenda. I have been logged in, but unfortunately, I just had to tie a couple of things up. But I did hear the comments that have been made by Elizabeth in terms of the importance of today's program and why it is that this research particularly speaks to where we are as a country right now. If young people are not given a voice, if young people are not given platforms to be able to inform the policy of government, it ultimately speaks to whether their needs are particularly being met in the kind of approach that we have by the leaders of the day. Helena, thank you so much for the partnership that you have also had in contributing to this program. So research like this, extensive as it is, over 9 provinces, being done all virtually. Stephen, I think you're going to be able to give us a better picture of how exactly that was managed and how much data you had to contribute to the program as well, in terms of making sure that the participants were able to be online. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Kathy, and good morning, everybody. It's very, very exciting to be here. This is one of the parts of my job that I love the most, and this has been such an amazing project to work on. I'm going to open with an African proverb which says, "Where you sit when you are old shows where you stood in youth." Not to say that we can't change our minds as the journey progresses, but if young people take governance as seriously as these people who contributed to the report, I think we're in very good hands in the country. I'm very proud that we have gotten to this day where we are, and we'll also be making my thanks at the end, so I'm not going to belabor that now. But just to say that we were in partnership in this program with the remarkable Tessa Dooms and Toby Fayoyin from Jasora Consulting. They opened our eyes, I think, in the way that they wanted to go about this. We were flexible enough to find a meeting ground, and we really worked in true partnership. So just to really acknowledge the work that Tessa does. She's phenomenal, has really got a great touch. And for example, she was very determined that young people would organize, that would run their own budgets for this program, for example. And also taught us that a lot can be achieved via WhatsApp. We have a very active WhatsApp group with about 130 people on that has kept this program on the rails. So we've also learned a lot about methodology of online work from you, Tessa, so thank you very much. So how did we start? As Elizabeth said, we've been doing APRM work for many years at the Institute. And we've tried to refine our methodology as we've gone through. A similar project was indeed launched in Namibia in 2018, and they produced a submission. We launched our Botswana report last month. So here's what the Botswana report looks like. And then we are also working in Zimbabwe at the same time. What's been really great is we've been able to cross-pollinate those processes. So we've invited people from the one country to give inputs in the other countries. And we really, as Helen has said, I think, are creating a governance community. So we started in about September last year, where we put out a call for young people who would be interested in this program through social networks, through media, etc. And we got a core group of over 100 young people who were keen to do this. In September, we had what was called a pre-planning workshop, where we outlined the APRM and explained how it worked and how young people could get involved. That was followed in October by a sensitization workshop, where we indeed brought in the APRM Secretariat. We brought in the head of the South African National Governing Council, who we were very delighted to have today, Tulani. We brought in various other presenters. And we went through, again, what the process is like. More people got onto the train, and we formed a working group, or in fact, 9 working groups. And those young people organized themselves on how they wanted to go about the process, where they wanted to spend their budget. And it was a very, very collaborative process of putting this report together. As I said, there was a very active WhatsApp group. Once the issues had been selected, of course, the young people had to provide a description of the issue, why it matters, and provide evidence from reliable sources and organize it all together. What we did also is we commissioned a background paper on those same issues. And once all the groups had submitted their work, we also worked with somebody who's now joined our staff, actually Kaylee Clifford, to combine the background paper with the submissions from the individual groups. That draft was then put online and circulated. In February this year, we had a validation workshop where everything was checked, where people could make comments. We could change things, we could add, etc. We also wanted to try to keep the report to a manageable length. I'm not sure if 112 pages is manageable, but there's a lot of information in there. So after the validation in February, we went into the production process, which takes about 3 months, which is brings us to today. So we checked the report, it was edited, it was laid out, and today we launch and publish. So that's a very brief journey so far, and look forward to what we're going to hear from everybody else today. Thanks.
All right, thanks for that, Stephen. I suppose it's an example of how innovative young people can be, especially with the power of just one device in their hands. Everything becomes possible if you look at it from that perspective. Let me then welcome the introduce Spiwe, or Q Spiwe rather, who's going to play us a video that really gives a snippet of what has gone into this work today.
Not only was it an exciting opportunity, but I wanted to be part of a group of people that bring forth ideas.
My participation was driven by the desire of wanting to be an active citizen.
All people, including young people and civil society, have a right to express themselves, especially on issues that directly affect their lives,
and contribute to the advancement or development of my country.
And as youth, create the future that we want.
The key takeout for me was the fact that for our country to develop, we cannot exclude young people.
Young people are not involved in the development of laws, policies, and programs that directly affect them.
Participation is important, whether it's youth choosing to be part of dialogues or policy making.
Young people's interests are frequently overlooked in the public policy sphere.
I believe any platform to participate is an opportunity to educate and be impactful.
There are so many brilliant and talented young minds out there who just need the space and the opportunity for them to participate in the governance of the country.
Youth participation is rooted in the young people's reality, vision, and concerns.
I think as young people, there is a need for a mindset shift. We need to move away from the challenges that we have and begin to look at the possibilities. We need to always ask ourselves, if there is a problem, what role am I playing in fixing it?
So there must be an obligation to work with young people in policy making.
If participation in policy processes is made part of formal processes where youth will be asked about their contribution.
Opportunities are created by funding the processes and initiatives that would allow youth engagement.
If we as young people can really be invested in that, then there's a lot that we can do to change our country.
I think this report should reach legislatures, leaders of political parties, decision makers in places like Parliament.
One would hope that it may be a catalyst to reviewing the policies of our country.
And through this report, there must be an understanding that the best laws and policies can only be effective if the input from civil society and the young people is considered.
This report becomes a roadmap, offering solutions for the broader youth developmental agenda.
And I hope that it can also be broken down into smaller chunks so that it can be disseminated for other young people to take the time to read and see the role that they can play in improving our country.
But it's certainly great to hear from some of the young people that have been actively participating in this process since it started. Let me then welcome to the platform Mr. Thulani Chifuta. He is speaking on behalf of the South Africa Peer Review Mechanism National Governing Council.
Good afternoon, Kathy, and let me also leverage on the acknowledgements you have made for protocol and convey my greetings to all leaders and colleagues who have joined this session today. Good afternoon. I should also indicate that I had invited one of the members of our National Governing Council, Mr. Thembinkosi Josopu, to join me as a lead person who represents the youth sector in our NGC in his capacity as the president of the South African Youth Council. That is primarily because for all work that is done in this platform to find expression throughout our work, he will have to champion and make sure that the voice of young people that comes through this platform and engagements does not go missing in our engagements in the NGC. We are truly grateful for this opportunity that throughout the pursuit of this work, the team has kept constant communication with our NGC and kept us in the loop about the developments of the work. That is why we also could not afford to miss an opportunity when this report is being launched. Of critical importance about this youth contribution is that just like the rest of Africa, South Africa is experiencing a youth bulge. And a youth bulge does not automatically translate into a productive developments in society because we have a youthful population. The youth bulge on its own presents risks and opportunities. The only time you can draw and reap a demographic dividend is only when you make productive investments in the lives of young people. And part of those investments will include providing space, opportunities, and support to young people. It is true that there has been a reduced level of activism on youth engagement and youth mobilization, which I think the processes of the APRM will spare no effort in providing a platform for that activism to be renewed for young people to express their voice. What young people must appreciate is that the majority of society position young people as a problem that must be solved. What society is missing is that whilst young people may have a myriad of challenges in their hands, the truth is equally that solution to those challenges can be found in the hands of those young people if they are provided with space, opportunities, and support. And so our experience is that given an opportunity, young people have always defined themselves as part of the solution. And they have proven that through this process that has been undertaken here. Where we are now as the NGC of the APRM in South Africa is that there are significant milestones that have been achieved, where all national structures have been established and fully functional. The national roadmap has been agreed and adopted, which sets the agenda of our work as the APRM NGC moving forward. It sets specific activities, milestones, and timeframes by when those should be achieved. We are even at a point where we have adopted a baseline document that will be used for general consultations out there. We are also glad that we are continuing to receive support from the Continental Secretariat of the APRM, led by Professor Eddie Maluka, with whom we have a follow-up technical meeting tomorrow as well, where we have been able to get resources from the Continental Secretariat that will enhance the technical work of our research institutions in contributing towards our self-assessment review report as a country. From now moving forward, we will be taking our work out there on the ground. The nature of our program will be informed by lectures, webinars, and thematic roundtable discussions that we'll be hosting. We will be opening a window. In fact, it may be a sliding door, where any time of the day a person can wake up and make open written submissions into different platforms of the APRM on any aspect of our work. We will be hosting dialogues. We will be continuing with sectoral stakeholder engagements, where we will meet with the legislative sector, the national parliament, and all legislatures. We'll be meeting with sectoral organizations and stakeholders. We will also be hosting community-based engagements and consultations on the ground, where general public can wake up and attend those sessions without being invited through a formal organization and so on. We will also be using the mainstream and the community media, and we will be going big in unveiling our social media platforms, where all this type of information can be presented. We fully appreciate the fact that all the things that we are about in the APRM will have a significant effect in the lives of young people. Hence, young people must take interest on the outcomes of the work that we do. The energy of young people must be focused in making sure that not only the articulation of the status quo is done and done properly, but proposals into what become our national program of action post this review is informed of. Because it is only from that national program of action that we will begin to take interest in making sure that those ideas are integrated into our national plans, into our national program, and they are budgeted for them to be implemented and implemented successfully. As the NGC, as far back as last year in 2020, we had taken a decision that in the design of our report, we will cover the thematic areas of the APRM on democracy and political governance, on economic management, on corporate governance, on socio-economic development, on the resilience of the state. In addition to those thematic areas of the APRM, we've taken a conscious decision that we will have a dedicated section of that report that will focus on youth. And the inputs that are made here may as well be the basis of us formulating that section. And lastly, as we have done before, we do again want to confirm that as the NGC, we will be leading from the front in giving an opportunity to young people who have been part of this process to make a brief presentation of this report to our NGC, which NGC is scheduled for 11 June 2021. You may not have all the luxury of time, as the agenda of that NGC is already packed, but we can confirm that you will be given an opportunity to make a brief presentation of the work that you have done, and thereby use that opportunity to say to the NGC, officially, here is our submission as we start with our work. And indeed, it will be the first of its kind that we'll be receiving prior to us being all over the country receiving those types of inputs and submissions. Thank you very much. We're delighted for being part of this program, and well done to all youth activists who have defined themselves to be part of the solution through this vibrant process. Thank you so much.
Mr. Chipucha, thank you so much for that. And I think it's an important opportunity that you are creating there in order to ensure that this research also lands on the ears of those that need to hear it most. So we certainly look forward to seeing how that will be received in your particular forum. Let me welcome then Professor Eddie Maloka, who is the APRM Secretariat. Mr. Maloka, over to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and our program director, and also let me join all the speakers in thanking SAIA for inviting us, and also for coordinating this event, and also for the report that we're launching today, and in particular, of course, recognize the CEO of SAIA, my sister Elizabeth. I've known her for many years now, and of course, Stephen, that we work with a lot, and her colleagues, I saw some of them, they were here, from the colleagues from SAIA who work with APRM, and also my brother who just spoke now, the chairperson of the NGC of South Africa, my sister, from SIDA, who was kind enough to join us from Addis Ababa, Helena, and all of us who are here, representatives of youth bodies and institutions that are participating today, and our experts, think tanks, and my colleagues from the APRM, and of course the African youth, and all of us, ladies and gentlemen. And to say that, of course, as we know that one of the things to really commend you for is for launching this event day after the celebration of Africa Day. And yesterday, everybody across the continent were celebrating Africa Day under the theme, Arts, Culture and Heritage, Levers for Building the Africa We Want. The theme should remind us that young people in Africa are at the forefront of advancing the arts, culture and heritage, and many more have been making a living through this discipline of the arts and and culture. The arts remain an untapped resource that African people can utilize in rebranding Africa while creating, of course, meaningful opportunities in the business and also on the employment front. I therefore want to congratulate South African youth who participated in the compiling of the youth submission that is the subject of our meeting today. This project commenced at the peak of COVID-19, and today I'm proud to be joining you in launching this important submission. The APRM Secretariat, Continental Secretariat, has been following the developments through interactions with SAIA, and SAIA has been a reliable partner, as I said earlier, in promoting the work of the APRM, and this project showcases the importance of research institutions, think tanks, and civil society in the architecture of the APRM, and of course, the entire African Union family. And then my brother, Stephen, and the video that we have just watched, it's really, you could say, an example of the work that that SAIA is doing, and we participated, I think, both in Namibia and also in Botswana, when you had similar engagement with civil society relating to the work of the APRM. So we really thank you, Stephen, and your colleagues, and you have been instrumental in not only galvanizing young people to participate, but also in producing knowledge products that highlight the work of the APRM. At the continental level, we have regularly worked with my dear sister Luanda Mpamosi, who's quite active as a youth advocate in SAIA and of course also in the APRM family. We as the APRM, we did when I started at the APRM, we have been doing a lot of work to address some of the shortcomings in the work that we do relating to youth. Well, among the other things we did, we organized the N'Djamena Youth Symposium that sparked some programs that you are currently seeing unfolding within the APRM, led by my colleague David Munyai, that many of us know, In addition, we have also constantly advised member states to upscale meaningful youth participation in the APRM process at national level. Such participation should go beyond a youth representative in the NGC, so it has to be substantive. And the African Union, as you know, knows that about 600 million young people in Africa are unemployed, are not adequately educated, and of course, they have all these challenges that we know of. APRM country review reports have consistently reflected out the issue of youth unemployment as a pressing governance challenge. Youth unemployment is cross-cutting and should be taken as an important issue and also as an early warning, because myself, I'm not that old, but I'm no longer youth, unfortunately, and it's an early warning issue that we should take into account, because the unemployed youth are later in the streets, are out there, and we don't know what can happen in societies. The launch of this submission is testimony of South Africa's youth resilience. Young people were able to organize themselves and produce a solid submission. And of course, I'm aware of the challenges of data and costs of participation that you all face. I hope South Africa, through the APRM NGC and our focal point, Minister Nkunu, can find a way of working out with the cohorts of youth in further improving their participation in the APRM process. And the president of the NGC here has given you some suggestions as to how you can fit this into the process that is led by the NGC. The African Youth Charter, of Excellencies, colleagues, remains the most important legal framework provided in the African Union and should be the main guide for member states in implementing national policies and programs and actions in support of youth development. During APRM country reviews, the APRM assesses the level of implementation, and in cases of poor implementation, recommendations are given and best practices are shared. In essence, member states of the AU are required to have national youth policy and national youth programs that include a number of issues, not, of course, exclusively. One is improved youth participation in development activities, the political area and decision-making processes, improved strategies for youth employment, a special fund for youth empowerment, and of course, financial support or credit allocation for project development. We already worked with Namibia, and Namibia, they embarked on a targeted review focusing on youth unemployment, and this happened in 2019. And the Continental Secretariat has been in discussion with the APRM Namibia in planning for activities that will share the findings of this report with the youth in Namibia, but also continent-wide. We're supposed to have a launch, including the youth, the Department of Social Development in Addis Ababa. We want to really focus on these issues that came out of this report. So we also recommend that South Africa youth who worked on this project take initiative and share lessons learned from the experience with other youth on us. So you can also reach out. We have this year, we have South Africa is doing a country review, Niger, Namibia itself, and Nigeria. So you could share what you are doing with these countries. And then talking about Nigeria, ahead of they are preparing for a second country review, and the APRM, the NGC has, I was there myself, working with our national office in Nigeria to launch what they call APRM Nigeria Youth Vanguard, whose responsibility will include the inclusion of youth in the APRM process and outlining the challenges faced by the youth in Nigeria. The APRM process can assist member states in identifying some of the shortcomings in governance, such as poor education, skills development, youth unemployment, and young people's health, including sexual and reproductive health, and of course, issues of gender equality and participation. I hope, colleagues, that this launch will inspire youth to find innovative ways of contributing to the APRM process. The APRM Continental Secretariat will continue to encourage member states to prioritize youth, and we will do our best to upscale youth engagement and youth programs in our work. And we are fortunate in that we have Tulani as the president of NGC of South Africa, because he, in his previous life, served as president of the South African Youth Council, and he's quite familiar with this terrain. I'm very confident that the South African NGC will take this submission that we are entertaining today, not just into consideration, but do so seriously. And Tulani has already given you a slot in the agenda of the NGC schedule for early June. So it's something that it's already a good sign. And we will do our best on our side. We will incorporate it into the preparations that we are doing for the second country review, also including sharing it with the lead panelists. And of course, we will also, as a Continental Secretary, continue to engage with the South African Youth directly and through SIA and other entities. I want to take this opportunity, therefore, to thank all the young people that were involved in this project. I also wish to extend my gratitude to our colleagues at CEDA, to Elena who are here, and also our experts who participated, the Jasoro Consultancy, and then of course SIA itself. And this is Africa Month. Stephen cited an African proverb. So I want to conclude my statement by just reminding us of what Amilcar Cabral. Amilcar Cabral was one of the leading figures of the struggle against colonialism on our continent. And of course, he was in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, and he's well known for the sharp mind. He was endowed with, of course, also for some of his excellent ideas, which continue to inspire us. And in one of his statements, he says, "Always remember that the people are not fighting for ideas, nor for what is in the man's, and you can say in the mind of a woman as well. The people fight and accept the sacrifices demanded by the struggle in order to gain material advantages, to live better and in peace, to benefit from progress and for a better future of their children." So the struggle and all these things that we are doing, they are not an end in themselves. We are doing this because we want to better our continent. We want Africa to claim its rightful place in the world and also in the 21st century. I thank you very much, Madam Director. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those words, Professor Maloka, and they certainly ring true for today. It really is about the kind of future that we want to build for our continent. Well, a lot has been said about this report so far, and if you haven't taken the opportunity to have a read through, well, this next session is going to help, because we're going to have the official presentation of the APRM Youth Submission. Let me welcome then Ms. Dimpo Lecheu, who's with Youth Lab, and Mr. Brian Mhlongo, who's with the DDP.
Good afternoon, colleagues. On behalf of myself and Dimpo and the rest of the youth represented in the APRM submission, I think it's a huge round of applause for SIA and Jasoro for the process that enabled us to get to this point. But essentially what I wanted to echo before we get into the sort of nitty-gritties is that what we're going to be speaking through is a summation of the report, not the full report, as it were. It's an 80-something odd page submission, and we've tried to bring it down to 11 slides, myself and Dimpo. So for the purposes of today's engagement, whilst we'll be given the broad outline, our colleagues from the other youth representatives are also in the room. When Q&A section comes, we'll try as much as possible to field them collectively, as it were. So the first part of the presentation that we wanted to be able to talk about was sort of highlighting our key sort of experiences and learnings. And part of it is around the idea that this specific process started from a place in which it attempted to access young people in the spaces in which they find themselves comfortable. So what is often problematic or difficult in attempting to engage young people is that we often sort of submarine them or put them into spaces where they don't necessarily feel comfortable, or their voices in those spaces aren't as valued as they ought to be. And so in these instances, young people were sourced from youth clubs, hubs, and other organizations that specifically work with young people. And in that regard, it was important then to ensure that we create an opportunity for that ability for them to participate meaningfully. There was also adequate capacitation of these young people. So it meant there was a workshop detailing writing processes, as well as research, and potentially even in instances where organizations do utilize dialogues as a means of engaging with young people. That space was also offered as part of the submission process. Of course, the last sort of part of that I want to highlight before Dimple comes in is the idea that this also was a combination of dialogues, or rather focus groups and research. This means that young people who necessarily weren't able to be a part of the online sessions were given an opportunity to, outside of the online sessions with their individual institutions and organizations who were part of the submission, to form dialogues and focus groups with which to engage the report or their section of the report in relation to this process. So for instance, you'll remember that Activate Change Drivers, which is an organization that works with young people and capacitating them, was quite often represented by one or two individuals in the online spaces, but they were able to hold their own sort of segmented briefing session, as it were. And then I think Dimple will be speaking about the last two learnings and key experiences. Dimple?
She might be on mute.
Sorry about that. I thought I had unmuted myself. I have to keep moving between my screens. Thanks, Pamandla. I think I'll be speaking to the key learnings in terms of collaboration. I think this process really opened us up to the importance of collaboration, especially in the youth development space, because that was the background of a lot of the participants. Being able to come together with young people who drive change in a number of areas that concern young people. So young people who work in the policy space like myself, young people who work in health, SRHR, young people who work in education. That kind of collaboration and coming together was very important so that we can bring about the holistic kind of submission that I think we've managed to put together. And then I think this also highlighted the inaccessibility of data when it comes to youth experiences, or at least I'll speak for myself. When we had to conduct the research that went into this report, it was very difficult to find, I think, relevant and I think new data that speaks to the lived experiences of young people kind of post-democracy. I'm going to hand back to Pamandla, who's going to start with the summation of the report.
Thanks, Dimple. So the first 4 chapters I'll work through, and then Dimple will join us back again for the other 5 chapters of the submission. I think the first one, speaking to political participation, provides an overarching background in terms of what the process that we wanted to engage in reflection of what the APRM is all about, or at least the specific presentation from SAIA, or rather a report that was being done by SAIA speaks to. So we have a demographic that is not unique specifically to South Africa, that speaks to necessarily what does it mean for young people to participate meaningfully in political spaces, particularly in the instance that they represent about 60% of the South African population. Of course, this is according to the expanded definition of young people, where we are looking at between the ages of 15 to about 34. And essentially what this then means is that we comprise a significant proportion of South Africa, or the country as it were, but there's still prevailing levels of exclusion and non-participation. When we talk about exclusion, these are tacit and and systemic insofar as the way in which they function. And this could be in as far as significantly excluding young people from the spaces where decision-making itself is happening, particularly when it comes to the ability of young people to stand for candidates, for instance, in political parties, for them to be able to be employed in certain positions. We see that the language and the ways in which the conversation around young people quite often speaks to young people's needs and issues being at the periphery of core political participation in those instances. One of the key ways we can highlight this is the idea that, for instance, one of the issues that we have in relation to the political participation of young people is this closed list proportional representation that we sort of allowed ourselves to get into at the point in which we were deciding how do we want our electoral system to be. This closed list proportional representation quite often means that political parties themselves make a decision about who is on their list that's going to be a part of the National Assembly. And then what that means is that we're heavily reliant on what the policy of that political party is about the demographic representation of who is on that list. And quite often, young people, firstly, are at the very sort of distant consideration of those political leaders in that space. And if they are part of that list, quite often they'll be co-opted into the mainstream agenda of that political party, which doesn't necessarily represent the interests of young people. Furthermore, what it also then means is that individual young people who don't have the requirement or don't want to see themselves in a political party have not necessarily been adequately represented because, as we know, the National Assembly is only now considering the potential for individual candidates to contest at national and provincial elections. And so that's the sort of candidacy that we speak to in this regard. Of course, when it comes to our non-participation as young people, there's something significantly wrong with the ways in which our political system is functioning. If, for instance, between 2016 and 2016 and 2019, the significant drop that we've seen in voter turnout, but moreover, the large discrepancy between the voter turnout that was happening in 1994 versus what we saw in 2019, where we went under 60% of 66%. And this is only speaking to registered voters, not about the ability of voters who are of voting age to actually be considered this. Of course, some of the recommendations that we then spoke about is that we need to revisit, and I hope that the space that we're currently in insofar as our electoral reform processes at the moment, we'll be revisiting the Van Zyl-Slabbert report, in which there was a recommendation about a need for a mixed electoral system. Of course, this ought to be an ongoing process. Then the second recommendation we made under this was that civic and vote education need to form part of primary and secondary schooling. There's a real need to educate all citizens, but primarily young people, about the need to be part of the conversation whenever we're talking about political participation. And then lastly, it's very important for political parties, government, and the institutions that derive from that to pursue institutional reforms that will encourage representation and participation. On the next area of social cohesion and inclusion, which is interesting because as Stephen was talking about, we do have a very active WhatsApp group. And part of the conversation that's happening on that WhatsApp group right now is about the ability of this report that we're publishing to be available in other languages. And so social cohesion and inclusion is also about linguistic recognitions of all communities. And so this is a context that we're working under because, as was mentioned earlier by the CEO of SIRE, youth is not a homogeneous group, and the ways in which we engage ought to recognize this. Of course, we live in a context where there's a legacy of racial segregation and oppression. There's significant gender-based violence, xenophobia, religious, racial discrimination and exclusion of the disabled. We have a very significantly underregulated or unregulated religious sector. There's also a real sense of poor visibility of foreign nationals in our sort of mainstream participation, but particularly when it comes to the demographic and statistics that relate to foreign nationals in our country. And that discussion generally happens only when we have issues of xenophobia sort of coming to the fore. There's a sense that there's a real sort of lack of representation And there's also violence against the LGBTQI community, that which we've seen, unfortunately, rear its head in the past couple of months as well. The recommendations that we made under that chapter was, firstly, to improve immigration legislation, which includes creating consequences for poor or inadequate implementation. In this country, it's an old song of ours that we have great legislation, but it bears no fruit if there's no real political will to actually do the work that's necessary in making sure that it becomes a reality. It's also important then to also improve the capacity of commissions, particularly when you look at this specific chapter, the Commission for Linguistic, Religious and Religious Rights, to exercise necessary oversight over their constituencies. The next recommendation we made was to increase funding for anti-gender-based violence efforts, along with increasing capacity for prosecution. Consequence management continues to be a very sore area for the ways in which our political and institutional crisis management is lacking in those instances. Representation of all genders and sexuality in all three tiers of government should be increased, especially in executive spaces like the Office of the Presidency. And I'll move on to the third chapter, which speaks to peace and security. I apologize if I'm moving a bit fast. Of course, I did say this is part of a very long report that we're trying to sort of make sure that we adequately represent within the space and time that we've been given. Peace and security, we spoke here under the report about improving immigration legislation. So it's important then that we speak to some of those things in relation to this. I think there might be a bit of an error in our presentation, but essentially some of those recommendations that we tried to make under this specific area was to speak to government creating or adapting existing legislation to address discrimination. Okay, I think I might be on the wrong page, just 1 second. When we spoke about peace and security, one of the overarching themes that we wanted to be able to focus on was this crisis of gender-based violence in particular. And part of what we were talking about in those areas was that South Africa is currently ranked as one of the most violent countries in the world, in which crime is both, and according to those rankings, we are looking at a situation in which crime, we are ranked as 127th out of 163 countries. In this instance, we said that crime is both political and systemic. When we look at things like corruption, police brutality, and human trafficking, these things are beyond the ability of individuals in essence to deal with. So they are not just individual repercussions, but they are real systemic repercussions to these types of crimes. There's a real sort of also lack of regard for the rights and the need for the psychosocial interventions that challenge the normalization of violence in South African society. And insofar as rehabilitation and reintegration, we think that there's also a real need for improvement in that regard. And in relation to peace and security, what we also spoke about as a recommendation is the creation or adaptation of existing legislation to address discrimination and protect the rights of marginalized groups and communities. There's a need to be substantive, there's a need for substantive changes in the way in which the country deals with gender-based violence, including allocating resources for adequate data collection and recording of crimes. Government should make room for addressing the underlying issues that encourage crime. Quite often, we opt for a very symptomatic approach to dealing with crime, as opposed to actually dealing with the core issues that challenge what issues come about as a result of that crime. Of course, the fourth pillar then I then addressed as part of my portion of the presentation is health and social services. And you'll see in the report that this was something that I sort of just took straight out of, because I think it does a really good summary of the context. It says that while South Africa has made a significant strides in creating a social safety net, inequality within the system means that even a fairly generous budgetary outlay does not create a fair and equitable society. Spending on social protection already crowds out government investment in sectors such as infrastructure and education. And unless there is a significant economic growth, there will need to be creative strategies to fund a more comprehensive and inclusive social security program. And that's essentially the context, and part of our recommendations as part of the submission was that social protection should be destigmatized through an awareness and civic education campaign that explains the social and economic benefits of the social protection system. Quite often there's this real political rhetoric that drives at the core of the stigma related to this, and some of which speaks to like calling South Africa a welfare state without a real analysis of what it means for us to be in that space. But also some of the more general societal stigmas that relate to grants for children, or childcare rather, and the impact it had on women, and the stigma that's associated with women who access child grants for the purposes of giving them a particular quality of life. An additional recommendation that we made was that government should use the findings from the National Health Insurance pilot sites to address issues related to financing, human resources, information technology, and quality in the finalization of the NHI bill. Of course, there's still a significant amount of work that ought to be done in this space, and in relation to the NHI, and we're still yet to fully understand the implications of the NHI. I think, of course, given that we are experiencing COVID-19, I do think that to some extent that needs to be reprioritized by government in order to ensure that this conversation is not lost in the broader scheme of things. The third and final recommendation under this specific heading was that, considering the National Adolescent and Youth Health Policy Plan, all high schools should have clinics stationed throughout the year to bring access to healthcare and education closer to the youth. This should include the rollout of inclusive and comprehensive sexuality education. I'll now hand over to Dimple for the remainder of the presentation. You may be muted, Dimple.
Okay, so I'm going to be starting with chapter 5, which looks at economic empowerment, which is a very important chapter as it's also one of the pillars of the National Youth Policy. And in this chapter, the team that was responsible for economic empowerment looked at the topic, I think, through the lens of inequality, poverty, and unemployment. So inequality, just highlighting the fact that South Africa is still grappling with inequality as one of the most unequal societies in the world. This is a result of the apartheid era and systematic challenges that still need to be addressed, but it's also a result of failing policies from 1994. And then in terms of poverty, it's just highlighting the fact that since 1994, South Africa has made some strides in reducing poverty. However, in 2018, nearly half of the country was still considered chronically poor. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has also undone some of this progress that was made. And then in terms of unemployment, in February 2020, the number had risen to 57%, but in June 2020 had again decreased, again because of COVID-19, playing a major role in undoing some of those gains, pushing unemployment to 32.5%, and the youth unemployment rate, which is currently sitting at 62.3%. Some of the recommendations that the group mentioned was the government, the private sector, and NGOs should work together to create paid volunteer opportunities so young people can gain practical work experience, because one of the major challenges of young people accessing especially entry-level jobs is that there is no work experience available for them. It's to enable rapid social mobility through the labor market in order to create a bigger middle class to alleviate poverty as well as inequality. And then to address economic empowerment from a rural and kind of peri-urban perspective, it's to conduct surveys in those townships and in those areas in order to understand what the local economic opportunities look like in order to drive economic growth in those particular areas, as well as to ensure that companies are paying women equitably to change the gender pay gap. Chapter 6 looked at institutional planning and some of the institutions and organizations that are supposed to drive the development agenda as far as young people are concerned. And this team looked at the AU Agenda 2063, or to the extent to which the AU agenda enables meaningful youth participation. And unfortunately, the current blueprint for development has not succeeded in mainstreaming the needs of African youth. They looked at the UN SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, and there is a great deal of convergence between the SDGs and the National Development Plan, about 74% similarity between the two policies. And then they looked at the challenges and opportunities with regards to the National Youth Development Agency. And I think the main point here was that some of the challenges that the agency is facing is the fact that the scope of the work that they do is quite broad because their mandate is to drive social and economic development for young people between the ages of 15 and 35. And as Pamandla mentioned, this can be quite difficult because young people are not a homogeneous group and their needs are quite different and diverse. And then there's an issue with implementation of the National Youth Policy. So the Department of Women, Youth and People Living with Disabilities recently launched the National Youth Policy for 2020 to 2030. And when you look at the strides that were made with the previous policy, not much has changed. So even the targets of the policy, of the new policy, very much look like the targets of the previous policy, which then leads you to ask, what kind of progress have been made between the two legislative documents. And then some of the recommendations that were made in that regard is a holistic and comprehensive youth response for planning, budgeting, monitoring, and evaluation, as well as auditing framework should be developed for these institutions that are responsible for driving the youth development agenda. The framework should provide clear indicators and targets that measure the level of youth engagement and representation in these processes. And then this framework should also track youth responsiveness in the implementation of various action plans, such as the SDGs, Agenda 2030, the NYP, as well as the National Development Plan. Chapter 7, which highlights the issue of land and housing. This group looked at access to land, water and sanitation, as well as infrastructure. With regards to access to land, the report does a really good job of going into the history of land ownership, the history of the Group Areas Act, and why land ownership or the distribution of land is the way that it is currently in the country. Women are the most affected by the issue of landlessness. And then with regards to water and sanitation, although policies relating to water and sanitation have been amended, there are issues such as the bucket toilet system, access to clean and safe water, and abrupt water cuts that are still prevalent, especially in townships and rural areas, and even in schools. And infrastructure affects the way that people are able to access information and the ease of communication, which is a very important factor in empowering individuals and increasing their economic opportunity. The recommendations look at informal settlements that need to be formalized and upgraded, policies that integrate existing informal settlements into city-town planning should be created, inclusionary housing should be prioritized as it gives low-income earners a place in the city, to access economic opportunities, social facilities, as well as schools. And then existing frameworks that strengthen women's and Black people's rights to ownership of land should also be implemented, as well as monitored and evaluated. The next chapter looks at access to quality basic and higher education through early childhood development, basic education outcomes, infrastructure, as well as the digital divide. The challenge with early childhood development being that it's difficult to provide quality ECD because there is no central agency that coordinates programs. And the challenge with basic education is that of the children who enter school in grade 1, only half of them actually manage to go through the entire schooling system and make it to matric. And then with regards to infrastructure, only 59% of schools currently comply with the minimum physical infrastructure standards. And then the digital divide, which I think was made more obvious with COVID-19, is how many young people who are in schools still don't have access to the internet, access to technological devices or digital devices. And only 30% of South African households have constant access to the internet. Recommendations that were made in this regard include strengthening school governing bodies to be fully trained, especially in the areas of finances, policies of the Department of Education, so that they can monitor the outcomes of the schools in which they're responsible for in line with the policies of the department. It's to develop a more comprehensive digital policy to widen the access of internet access. And then the governance of critical digital infrastructure should include data and privacy protection and an integrated infrastructure plan to prepare itself for the digital economy. And finally, formerly disadvantaged schools should be provided with adequate budgets in order to address the infrastructural backlog. And finally, with regards to climate change, the first point is on climate change and inequality, which speaks to the fact that you can't talk about climate change without talking about social justice, because different communities are impacted differently by climate change, and people who are living in already poor and marginalized community have experienced climate change to a greater extent. And then policy and implementation. So there's a disconnect between climate policies and them actually being implemented. While there are several policies and laws that focus on it globally and locally, there are still many challenges when it comes to implementation. And then public and private partnerships. So communities need to be allowed to bid for projects and developments in their area, such as renewable power plants. And then with regards to recommendations, which speaks to the last point, it's local community and youth being consulted in the formation and implementation of policies with regards to the environment. Youth engagements should be targeted and comprehensive rather than tokenistic. Corporates need to be more accountable for their contribution to environmental degradation. And finally, the government and the public sector need to collaborate to develop new ways of waste management systems. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dimpo and Brian, for that presentation. It really has been quite extensive, at least in terms of the areas that this research has covered. But of course, this was just a summary. The link for that full report is available in the chat group. And I also see that people have been writing different messages, asking various questions about how this research was conducted. Looking a bit at the time, I think we are running a little late in terms of our program. So I am going to ask everybody that's part of today's session just to stay tuned. I promise that we will ensure that we wrap up with the program soon. I will, however, ask the next two guests who are coming on, perhaps just to speak to the questions that have been raised around this research, especially when it comes to young people in rural areas versus those in urban areas, and the extent to which the voices that are represented in this research has accommodated for the length and breadth of the country in terms of the views of the young people that it represents. So let me welcome then to actually give us the official report launch, if I can put it that way. Stephen, you've already seen him earlier. He did talk about Tessa Dooms, who, in my words, is just superwoman, effectively. So Tessa, let me also then welcome you to the platform.
Thank you, Kathy. And so I'll jump in first before Stephen officially launches us. But firstly, I want to appreciate the young people who've been a part of this journey and a part of this experience. When Saya approached us as Jasoro Consulting to lead this, one of the things that we said we absolutely need to do is make sure that the young people are included from the inception of the idea, in terms of what the issues are, to the point that we launch this event. And I'm very happy to say that we managed to get a group of young people who really stayed the course with this entire program. And so I want to congratulate the over 120 young people who participated in this. When you see the report, you'll see their names are listed there. And one of the extraordinary things about this process was that we were able to get young people from rural and urban backgrounds in the country. And I think COVID was a bit of a blessing in disguise in this regard, because it meant that because we were online, we were able to ensure that as many young people from different areas who may not have been able to come to Joburg had we done this in person, were able to then log on online. Saya had set aside some data to ensure that young people were able to participate from anywhere in the country. And I think that that was a major success and definitely something that we need to learn from in terms of the youth development sector. And so we also saw a very good balance of gender. We saw many of the project leads for the different thematic areas were women. And I think we can be very proud of having a team that of young people who were opting in, came from different backgrounds, different education levels, different experiences, and I think enriched this process greatly. From our side as Jasoro, we had the privilege of putting this together, and I can tell you that what you see in that report is only a fragment of the work that was done. There was a lot of research that went into this that the young people did on their own terms in their groups. And what we were able to do was just articulate it in different ways and cross-reference a few things. But really, the main of this report was put together by the young people that you see, whose names are listed there. And I think that that's something that we can really, really be proud of. These insights have, I think, have really good potential, not only to enrich the APRM report and the APRM submission that South Africa makes, but also to enrich youth development in this country, and really shows the contributions that young people can make and should make to our landscape as a country. And I think we've as Saya and Jasoro have learned so much from the young people, both in terms of the content they produced, but also just in terms of what it takes to get youth participation right. We also have an insights paper that I think Stephen can speak to a little bit, where we share some of the insights of the journey that we've walked with the young people and what meaningful youth participation can really look like. And so I hope the young people are proud of what it is that they've been able to accomplish, as proud as we are of being able to partner with young people in this meaningful way and produce, I think, a report we can all be proud of. So thank you so much for everybody who's attended this. And I hope that as you read the report, it enriches both your work and also the way that we view South Africa going forward.
Thanks, Tessa. That was great. And now you can see some of the dynamism of working with Tessa, who helped us break our stereotypes and get out of our comfort zone and really do a creative, participatory process for this report. I'd now just like to ask everybody if you wouldn't mind putting on your cameras if you can for the official launch, just so we can all wave and we can take some nice pictures for the website. So if you can, please put your cameras on and put it into the gallery view. So we've got a nice display of people's cameras. So I'll give you a sec to do that. Yeah, that's much better than just seeing everybody's names. I know it eats up more more data, but it's really nice to see people participating. That's great. I'm going to take a picture before we, well, I'm going to ask my colleagues actually if they wouldn't mind taking a picture. Isabel or Kaylee or Luanda, please just take a couple of photos. Yes, I'd like to declare the report officially launched. It is available on the website. Some people have pointed out a couple of names that were spelt incorrectly. We are working on that, so please be patient. But as soon as we can, we'll get the updated version. And then just maybe if everybody could wave or do something so that we can see the faces and a little bit of action as we take the photos. Great. Kathy, do you want to, are we going to open it up for some questions, or do you want me to do the closing thanks now?
Look, I think I'm really in your hands on this one, and perhaps everybody still got their cameras on. Just an idea, can we spend about 5 minutes taking questions on the report? Are people okay to still stay on for that? Yes? Okay, so I think let's go ahead and do that then, because I think it will be important just to also get some of the views of those that have been part of this conversation. So what I'll do is that I'll just ask you to please maybe, if you can put your questions in the chat group. I know that there are already some questions that have come up in the chat group. And while we're talking about the chat group, if you go to the bottom there, you'll find a link and it's just a quick survey that has been put up. And if you can please just ensure that you'd fill in that survey for us so that we're able to improve the SIRE events going forward, it'll really be appreciated. So I'm just going to ask that if you have specific questions, you can put them up in there. But let me go to one or two of the things that I can pick up. And this one is from Smith Street, which is who is one of our panelists. The NDP 2030 speaks about active citizenry, but what happens in spheres of our governance, that contradict our systems, and they end up becoming redundant. We have a lack of innovations mechanism, no reviewal of the failures of the Millennium Development Goals, and now it's the Sustainable Development Goals, no proper integration or planning for local economy development tools. So how do we move forward and make a reality the goals of Vision 2063, which I suppose it falls in line with the greater a criticism that often embodies the kind of work that is done, that speaks to the issues that are being faced on the ground. You know, we know that there are different bodies that have been created, whether you look at the AU level, at the UN level, that seek to foster youth participation. But what is the lived reality of those different institutions, and how far does it actually go in ensuring that the voices of young people are well represented? But representation is just the beginning, that it actually translates into meaningful change that we can point to at the end of the day.
Kathy, with your permission, I'd like to perhaps just point to a few people who were part of the writing process who can probably speak to that, just to save us time. I see there's Kenneth Diole on the call and there's Sibusiso Muzomba. I think Kenneth can speak to the institutional planning and the SDGs and Millennium Development Goals, whilst Sibusiso can probably take the question that was asked about the land and cities on the chat function. And this is just to save us time, and I'm not picking on anybody. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kenneth. I speak as one of the participants. I was part of the institutional planning group. Thank you for throwing me under the bus, Luanda. I was not prepared to speak, but I'll say a few things. I think one of the key things that stood out, especially in the group that we're at, was the young people who were part of the group came from different vantage points. So there are some who work in public sector, there are those in civil society, and there are some of us in private sector. And even just in our placement, we viewed the same issues in a different perspective. From those particular policies that Luanda speaks about, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the the African Union, Agenda 2063, among, even at a local level, the National Youth Policy, when we looked at that, was that I think in many regards, there is an acknowledgement that work has been done to include and acknowledge the work, the issues that are facing young people. But I think the biggest takeaway for most of us was really that the implementation component is where it is missing. And I think our approach really looked at that. So how do we ensure that the implementation will be done, and what are some of the key matrices that we need to be part and parcel of the implementation process? And at that particular perspective, we looked at how do we create indicators to ensure that monitoring and evaluation is part and parcel of the process, that there is actually a budget for that process, and that we can monitor that, because we believe that especially over the next 10 years or so, youth participation, meaningful participation, but also the monitoring and evaluation of what the work actually looks like is of paramount importance. And that's really the perspective that we went about. We acknowledge that, yes, there are shortcomings here and there, but at a key level, it is really the M&E framework, and more importantly, ensuring that the various institutions that are put in place to ensure the implementation of these policies and these policies actually are equipped to do so, and do so in tandem with young people. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. And just to answer the question on land. And so what we in our research while we were working, we did see that the issue of land still quite reflects, the legacy of apartheid. It's still a very big component of what some of the problems and the issue that we see today. Being some of them, the issue of unequal distribution, it's still quite polarized. And although there have been some interventions that have taken place since 1994, what you find is that communal farmers, they still, face issues with illegal eviction and not having, they're not given the capacity that that they need for them to then grow in the land sector in the country, and also, the issue of lots of crowding in urban areas, because there was, during during apartheid, there was a lot of compartmentalization of the different, races and so on. And so we still see that today. It's still quite a reflection of what has taken place. And so in envisioning the picture of success, as young people, we wanted to be involved in that process of ensuring that the issue of land is addressed in the country. And so making sure that while trying to do that, we are intersectional. And so making sure that communal farmers who are women, especially, because then, vulnerable women, they're the ones who are affected the most by unequal land distribution and poor land reform policies. So prioritizing communal farmers and tapping into the lots of potential that exists in rural areas, in rural spaces, seeing as to, how we can work with that and how we can integrate that into policy to uplift communal farmers in rural areas, and also address the issue of spatial planning within the urban areas. And so integration to, new and unused areas within some of the urban areas that exist. And also just with infrastructure, we're in the fourth industrial revolution already, and so really prioritizing some of our internet facilities, and how COVID-19 has really exposed the entrenched inequality that exists with regards to access to data, access to internet, and so we have really seen the picture that has been painted by COVID-19. And so trying to really work on that, working on the inequality that exists with access to internet and resources was a key goal of ours. And so all in all, just making sure that, we address the issue of the inequality with access to land and access to internet and resources as well. Those were some of our key principles. And
Spusiso? All right, it looks like we've lost Busiso there as he was about to conclude his remarks. Stephen, I'm going to hand over to you just so that you can officially wrap us up. But I think an important point, I see you've also answered it on the group, but just to add to the questions was whether there were any differences or significant differences between South Africa, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. This is in terms of the priorities that concern young people, given we're all in the same region, but are we really experiencing problems in the same way?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there were some common issues. Everybody's tackled the climate crisis, for example, education, health, and poverty, inequality are common issues. And of course, many of these issues have to be solved across borders. In South Africa, I think crime was more prominent than it was in other countries. And also, I think the South African report talks to LGBTI issues more so than the other countries, although definitely Botswana did include them in their report. So it's interesting, and maybe that's our next task, is to do a comparative analysis as to what civil society thought was the most important across the various countries. But hopefully we can still have time to chat, but I do want to do the thank yous, and firstly to say, I don't even know where to start this. Maybe I'll start with another African proverb, which says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And that's been absolutely the story of this project. Firstly, I'll thank Sarasa and Ndumi in our events department, who have had countless webinars that they have put us through, and meetings, and they've always been fantastic and really making sure that we accomplish what we need to. A big thank you to Spiwe and Nikki in our communications department for the Canva graphics, for the infographics that you would have seen on social media in the last couple of days. I think they came out absolutely amazing. The work on social media, and also to Ian, the designer of the infographics. Then the video that you saw earlier, I have to thank Kutsia on our team, and Matthew, who put the video together, as well as Luanda. We were looking for something that was edgy and exciting and interesting, not too long, and summarized the main issues. And I hope we achieved that. That song might be in your head for days. It was in my head for days. Also, huge thank you to Alex Begg, Kiara, and Angela for actually putting the report together. I hope you guys are all downloading it and going to read it. Yeah, the final corrections will hopefully be made today. Then to our background, the person who wrote our background paper, Chipo Hakumona. It was really an excellent paper and provided the skeleton onto which we were able to put the submissions. Thank you to Kaylee Clifford, who was our blender, who combined the background paper with the submissions. To Helena and the government of Sweden for their active role, their interest, their encouragement, and their support for our work, not only in South Africa, but also in Botswana and Zimbabwe. And we're hoping maybe to do some work in countries like Lesotho and Malawi going forward. To Elizabeth and Noima from SIA for your constant support and encouragement, even when I came to you with this crazy idea of putting these reports and these processes together. A huge thank you to Tessa and Toby, from whom we've learned a lot and have really democratized the process. The young participants themselves, especially Dimpo and Brian, who presented today. Thank you, guys. Thank you to Eddie Maloka at the APRM Secretariat for your constant support and willingness to engage with us. And a special shout out to Lennon Monyai at the APRM, who has done amazing work on youth and really made it his own in the last couple of years. We are privileged to be your partner. I'd also want to thank our Youth at SIA program and Des Koshulik for, again, amazing work done over a decade. Many of your graduates, Des, and your participants were integral to putting this report together, so keep up the good work. I'd like to thank Tulani in his absence. He had to leave, but for the support. And of course, we're going to take him up on the offer to present to the National Governing Council. Guys, that's big. Doesn't always happen. That's a testament to the work and the quality of work that you've done. A huge thank you to Kathy for emceeing today and your interest shown in this. I hope we can maybe get onto one or two of your TV shows or radio shows to showcase the report. I hope I haven't left anybody out, because I'm going to end on saying thank you to Luanda. Mpongose, who has been my right-hand woman on this project. Lots of WhatsApps, lots of meetings. Luanda, thank you so much. And I joke that I feel sometimes like I'm a sheep that has been led into a green pasture, and I get so excited and I want to run everywhere. And Luanda is that sheepdog that directs me, that channels the energy, that gets me in the right place. So Luanda, thank you very, very much for really hard work, but gratifying work on this. And that will be the official closing. If we do want to stay on for some discussions and chats, I'm happy to do that, but I did want to make sure that we got everybody's thank yous into everybody. Back to you, Kathy.
All right, Stephen, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I'll certainly try and ensure that you get as much coverage as possible, because it's really great work that has been done here. It's also great for me to reconnect with Saya, reminding me of my roots. Des will know what I'm talking about. So I definitely think that I need to make time to go back in particular to the youth program and see how I can give back there yet again. Yeah, so Stephen, you brought something up that is making me feel like, there's this little monkey on my back that I now have to attend to. So thank you to all of the guests today again for participating and being part of this session. As Stephen said, the platform is going to remain open in terms of just some of the offline discussions you may want to have. But I think for the official launch, this could well be a good time to press the stop button in terms of the official recording of the program. So at this point, I think, Luyanda, I will hand over back to you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I think we've come to the end of our session today. I think people can start logging off if they have to run, but we will just stay on for a couple of minutes to show the video again for those who were not able to see it earlier. And after that, we will be ending the meeting officially. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Thank you, Spiwe, over to you.